formal than I usually am. And some of you probably wondered, what in the world is he wearing a tie before? You thought maybe it might have been because of the baptism, right? And, what did you do with our pastor? Well, I don't know if I can preach with a tie on, but there actually was a method to the madness here. And that is. No worries, no worries. Wasn't quite sure how to pull this off, but so before I read today's text, I want to point out that in the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul is already dealing with the same issue that comes up for a lot of us when we talk about God's amazing grace. Paul had the overwhelming task of convincing his own people, the Jewish people, who had been given the 10 Commandments and a whole lot of other rules, over 600 other rules in what we call the Old Testament. And he had to convince them, who had been brought up thinking that the whole point was to obey the rules. That's how you get okay with God, is to make sure you live up to a certain set of standards. And if you don't, you're in trouble. And he had to tell them, the rules have their place. But the whole point is grace, of knowing that you're loved no matter what. And as you can imagine, that was not good news to a lot of his friends and his family that he'd grown up with. They're like, what in the world are you saying? And so some of them started to say, well, then, what's the point, Paul? Then why even have the rules? Or if God's going to love you no matter what you do, then anything goes. Why even be good? So that's the backdrop and the situation that Paul's writing to. Romans 2, verse 4, he says, do you despise the riches of God's kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? And repentance, the Greek word there, it means metanoia. It means a larger mind or a whole new way of thinking. The Message version of that same verse says, better think this one through from the beginning. God is kind, but God is not just soft. In kindness, God takes us firmly by the hand and leads us into a radical life change. And then a little farther on in that same letter to the Romans, Paul says, so what shall we say? Should we continue in sin in order that grace may increase? By no means. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? Well, as I've said several times already today, and as we've sung together, baptisms, and especially with babies and children, are all about the grace of God. And in our recent sermon series that we're departing from for a couple of weeks here with these baptisms, we'll come back to our sermon series called Eve, Adam, and the Snake on the first couple of chapters in the book of Genesis. But grace has come up every time so far. God's grace, or grace is God's response and the antidote for the original human problem, which was not just disobedience, but talking ourselves into thinking that God hasn't given us enough. And grace then makes clothes for that original couple to cover them up once they had exposed themselves in a way that they couldn't deal with. Grace came and found them in the garden when they were hiding. And we talked about how God always comes looking for us when we lose ourselves. God will always find us. Grace lets us know it's okay to take responsibility for our mistakes. And instead of being so afraid and ashamed that we blame or project onto somebody else, grace lets us know, hey, it's safe. You can tell the truth. Let's just deal with reality. Grace, 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 amazing grace. Are you sick of it? Sometimes people say, kind of like the people that Paul was writing to, oh, this is great. Okay, grace, grace, grace. But, you got to change your life too, don't you? And I would say, yeah. But the real issue is what motivates the change and what leads to the deepest, most lasting, most life-giving change. Some of you have heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a Lutheran pastor in Germany in the 1930s. And Bonhoeffer was killed for opposing Hitler. He was hung after being arrested. And I could say a lot about that, but not today. But he's known for writing or contrasting between what he called costly grace and cheap grace. He aimed his critique, among other places, at churches in Germany as Hitler was coming into power, who preached and proclaimed love and grace, but who never said a thing about Hitler, and who were just quiet, feeling like it wasn't their place, as he ascended and galvanized his power that led to the atrocities we all know about. And Bonhoeffer said that grace is a response to God's love, or is love, but we need to respond to that love. And we respond by committing ourselves to being vessels of love in the world. And he made the point again and again that it's love that calls forth love. Well, I've been thinking about this. What really does help us to change when we need to change, either within ourselves or motivate us to make changes in the world that we're convinced, based on the best of who we are as people of faith, need to be made? It's certainly not obligation. But that has its place. A sense of duty has its place. But I don't think it will motivate us in the deepest ways. Not obligation, not guilt, certainly not shame or threat or fear. It's love that motivates us. And what I mean by that is just for us, trying to come to terms with or realize just how incredibly loved we are. And once we get that grace is free but not cheap, that there was a cost, and almost always is a cost somewhere when real love shows up and makes a commitment. I love sports. I have to admit it. I watch a lot of ESPN. Sometimes, they do those stories on the background stories of an athlete. Like when someone signs a big contract or wins a trophy, a Heisman Award or something like that, they'll do human interest stories on the athletes. And a lot of times it flashes back to where they came from. And a lot of those professional athletes came from difficult situations. And I'm a sucker for this stuff. It'll bring tears to my eyes when the award finally comes and some strapping stud of an athlete, male, female, whatever, comes and gets the trophy. And the first thing, maybe they thank God, which is great, but that always makes me a little nervous. But then they usually say something like, I got to thank my mom. And then they flash to the human interest story, and the mom worked 3 jobs scrubbing floors so that her kids could have an opportunity. And he takes the award and he says, I'm grateful for this. But this is yours, Mom. That's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about the grace of God. Oh, we're grateful for what's been given. But we also know that there's a cross at the center of the story. And we'll say more about that in another sermon series and really get into that. It's time. But I feel the same way when vets are honored. Apart from all the questions about warfare as a way of solving differences or politics or whether or not this or that campaign was just or should have happened at all, apart from all that, I love it when people simply recognize the incredibly difficult situation vets were in and their courage and their bravery and that they did what they could. And the older the vet gets, the more I love it. As a way of just saying, hey, the rest of us realize that the freedoms we enjoy, they don't just happen. So we're free, and thank God we are, but there was a cost. I feel the same way when I watch or listen to African Americans or women talking about those who paved the way for them to have the right to vote. And who honor those who came before. We watched the film that Otis Moss Jr. made about his father in church. We watched that one time. Some of you were here. About the price that this Black man in the South paid for showing up time after time at polling places to be rejected and denied. And that film, by the way, won some major award just recently. But the same goes for the forerunners of women's right to vote. And all I can say is it is unimaginable to me that we are so close to giving away or throwing away some of these cherished freedoms in our nation as we drift toward authoritarianism. And that voter suppression is a slap in the face, especially to people of color or those traditionally disenfranchised who paid the price for the freedoms that we enjoy. And I feel the same way when my favorite seminary professor, Dr. Cornel West, begins almost every address. If you don't know who I'm talking about, go on YouTube and do a search for Cornel West and listen to him speak. He's amazing. He begins almost every address that he ever offers, whether it's to a completely secular group or a church group, or whether he's on, a talk show with Bill Maher on TV. He says something like this. He says, I just want to begin by saying I am somebody because somebody loved me. I am who I am today because somebody loved me. And then he starts naming the names of the Sunday school teachers at the church he grew up in. He says, my church as a child told me I was a child of God and worthy of being loved. And they burned that into me. I heard it again and again and again. You can do something with your life, Cornel. So that's why I am who I am. Well, the grace of God is that free gift that costs everything. And I'm going to close by telling one of my favorite Tony Campolo stories as we head toward our baptismal party at the end of worship. I've told this story at least once before, but it was right toward the beginning of my being with you, so a lot of you haven't heard it before. Tony is a friend of mine. He's probably close to 90 now. He had a severe stroke about 5 years ago, and so he isn't doing much public speaking or teaching. But Tony, in his day, was an amazing preacher, speaker, professor of sociology, author, and relentless evangelist. He did like at least 200 events a year, traveling around. he had an impact on so many people. A lot of my songs and my stories come from Tony and his stories and his songs. And he was as funny as he was brilliant, and a master communicator who would preach the unconditional love of God in a way that motivated people to want to respond with their lives. I was doing music at a fundraising event for a Haiti organization in Vero Beach, Florida one time. And Tony was the keynote speaker. And so after I had finished, Tony got up there, and Tony, he has a zillion little stories and jokes that he usually uses at the beginning of his addresses. And it's his way of trying to kind of find out who he's talking to by what they'll laugh at. And he was kind of bombing with this group. I mean, the organization we were raising money for was a faith-based organization, but the event wasn't in a church. And Tony really couldn't get a feel for who he was talking to. And so he would say jokes that, were too churchy or too biblical or something. Like he said, I remember he used he said, my cat, I have a Calvinist Presbyterian cat. He said, my cat's name is Calvin, named after John Calvin, one of the forerunners of Presbyterianism. He said, yeah, Calvin, whenever he sees me on the rocking chair, he just comes over and sticks out his tail and looks at me, and the chair going back and forth as if to just say, just get it over with, will you? Now, if you don't know Presbyterianism, which is one of John Calvin's things, was predestination. So that, you had to know that to get the joke. All right, well, he told a lot of jokes that the audience didn't know. And you could just see this master communicator trying to hone in on who he was communicating with. And so finally he takes off his glasses and he looks at him and he says, the other night, I saw Tony, by the way, is a Philadelphia accent, Italian guy. I mean, that's where my Italian roots come from. So I, just feeling this guy. He says, yeah, the other night I was home with my wife and I said, honey, you want to go upstairs or make love? Because at my age, I can't do both. And the whole place busted into laughter. And then he says, you didn't tell me this was a United Church of Christ group. Yeah. So Tony was in Hawaii, true story. And he was the keynote speaker at a conference there. And after the first day, he went to his hotel and he couldn't sleep. And there was a diner, an all-night diner across the street. So finally, about 2:00 in the morning, he decides to go to the diner and, get a piece of pie and work on his address for the next day. And while he's there, there's a group of women who sat down in the booth next to him. And he could tell by their dress that they were women of the evening. And he said, I wasn't trying to listen, but they were talking kind of loud and I couldn't help it, and he overheard one of them say, yeah, tomorrow's my birthday. And the rest say, well, how are you going to celebrate it? Yeah, the way I do every day. And then she got up and left. And so Tony gets up and goes over to the table and says, excuse me, I wasn't trying to listen, but I just overheard your friend say that tomorrow's her birthday. I got an idea. He said, let's throw a party for her. He said, could you all come back tomorrow night? And they said, yeah, we're here every night about this time. And he said, okay, come back a little early tomorrow. I'll get the stuff. You just show up and make sure you get her before your friend, and we're going to surprise her. And I mean, you can imagine them, what they thought about this guy, but they did it. They did it. He gets the stuff, the balloons, a cake. Her name's on the cake. They show up and they surprise this woman who walks into this diner. Happy birthday. They have the party. Then they all leave. And Tony was cleaning up, and there was nobody else left in the diner 3:00 in the morning, except the guy that worked there. And the guy says to Tony, all right, you made me uncomfortable and I've been skeptical, but I've been watching you. Why'd you do this? You don't know these women? And Tony said, well, I just believe everybody's life ought to be celebrated. And the guy said, well, what are you doing here? You live around here? He said, no, I'm here with a church conference. He said, church, church. Said, I don't think I believe in God, and I definitely don't believe in church. What church do you go to, though? And Tony said, well, I go to a church that gives parties at 2:00 in the morning for women of the evening. And the guy said, no, you don't. He said, yes, I do. Here we are. And the guy said, well, if there were a church like that, I would go to it. And Tony said, well, you're at it. Where two or more are gathered in my name, in the name of love, God's with us. Every life is worth celebrating, having a party for. That means your life, even in the worst chapter of it. That means the life of the people that you are really wrestling right now to try to love. There is no better news than grace. It's amazing. But let's never forget that it costs everything. And that the only real response worth it, that is worthy of it, is to say, I love you too, God. Use my life to help someone else know that they're loved. Amen.